There you go. Good morning, Stuart.
Good morning, Tom, and everybody else. So this session, it's designed to complement some of the sessions that Tom and I and occasionally Mike Wilson have been running throughout the week about audience response systems. And I've latched on to Tom's expertise quite significantly because he knows a hell of a lot more than I do about audience response systems. What this session is going to be doing is trying to work through some examples of how you can use audience response systems such as Neopot, Vivox, Padlet, what have you, to engage students in understanding and shaping their assessments. It's going to work through some practical examples, but also talk a little bit about what co-creation is all about. And a little bit about how you frame things like learning outcomes and how they feed into assessments. So some of this will be quite old hat, but it's going to have a new spin on how you run it through audience response systems. Now, I will be leading most of the session. Tom will be here to point out to me exactly what I've done wrong in terms of setting up something for an audience response system, because I think sometimes it's really useful to model bad practice. And I'm no expert in this area, Tom is. So I'm going to make a few mistakes as I go along, or maybe I've picked the wrong option for how to engage you as an audience. And Tom is going to correct me, hopefully not too often, but feel free to do so when needed. So there's a link in the chat to a Neopod page, which will have a series of activities that I'm asking you to do throughout the session. If you click on that link now, you should be able to see the session names. I think what I'll do is share my screen so you can see what it looks like on my end as well, because as you're responding to various things, you'll then be able to see what it looks like when it comes in. Join my sharing screen face. I'm sure I'm doing the right thing. So you should be able to see now a screen in WebEx, which has session names on, but hopefully you've all clicked on the link and gone through to Neopod as well.
Just to quickly jump in, if the link isn't working for you, although it did work for myself, if you go to join.neopod.com, I've pasted that link into the chat as well as the code VLXOE. So if you can't get on from the link that Stuart sent, please do try going just to join.neopod.com in a web browser, and then the code is VLXOE, which you can see at the top left of Stuart's screen. I'll let you carry on, sorry.
Now we'll give it a few minutes because, well, hopefully not a few minutes, but I see people joining. We've got 15, 16, and hopefully you can see in the bottom left-hand corner. This is one of the good things about Neopod compared to some other systems like this, is that it tells you whether your students are actually there or not. If you're running a live session, you can, those of you who came to our session yesterday about Neopod will know already, also run asynchronous student-paced sessions. But this is a live version because I'm going to ask you to do things and then we're going to discuss them. We're up to 19. Where does that place us in terms of the amount of participants?
We have 32 participants.
32 participants. So there's still about 10 of you who are just settling into Neopod. We'll give it another 30 seconds and then we'll carry on because there aren't any tasks coming immediately and you can see what's happening on my screen as well. Some of you might just be passively watching the session with a cup of tea, which is fair enough.
The other bit you can do is also jump in at any point and it will take you to the point of the session that Stuart's at that particular time. So
as I said, more off the cuff than what my slides said. Today, we're going to workshop an example of taking a co-creation approach to engage students in assessment and using Neopod as the main structure for this. So that I'm not going to focus on the details of how I set it up, but there'll be some little bits you can see how things like quizzes and collaboration boards work on the back end. But also, I'm going to show you some other audience response tools. As I've said here, I wouldn't ever recommend using this many audience response tools in one session, and certainly not necessarily this diversity, because there's stuff from Neopod, there's a Padlet, a Vivox. There might be something else. We'll find out as we get through it. We've got 26 people in now, but if you're not in yet, as I say, you can follow along on the slides anyway. I need to move the chat box because it's blocking my window of how I can change my slides. So just very quickly, I've said audience response an awful lot already, but essentially an audience response system is a technological tool which lets your students engage with you as you're running a session. Now, those of you who have got into the Neopod link, hopefully your slide has changed. So you can see that this is a tool which is not just about engaging the audience and responding to things, although you'll see some examples of that coming up. It's essentially can be a replacement for PowerPoint, but it runs at your pace. So students keep up with you as you set it, unless you run an asynchronous student-paced version, which is also possible. We're not going to focus on that today, but if you want to, do get in touch with us or come to one of the other sessions. Not sure if we're repeating that one. I'll have to check and let you know. But
the video is up online if you want to watch it from yesterday.
That was probably what I was looking for, Tom. Thank you. There's a video of that session, and I'll volunteer, Tom, to help anyone who does want any advice on Neopod as well. And what audience response systems do is they allow students to engage in sessions in a way that's not quite like a discussion, but can be anonymized, can be synchronous, can be asynchronous, but there's a wide variety of them, and I'm going to run through a few of the more basic ones. I say basic because they're the ones that I can handle, and Tom may chip in and tell us some more advanced or some more interesting things as we go along. Clear in my throat, that is a photo of me, looking somewhat different, you may notice. I like to teach creativity using things like play. I use lots of props. I use lots of handouts in my teaching. The coronavirus happened, and now I teach like this. So if I look at that picture closely, which I think was taken a couple of months ago, I gained some weight in lockdown. So we won't dwell on that. But we want to still ensure that students they're meeting the standards that we expect for them and that they understand their assessments. And the easiest way to do this, which I'm sure isn't a surprise to most of you, is to ask them. But how we go about asking them can be more challenging in these distant times. So I'm going to show some examples as we go through. Now, I've said I like to teach a bit more messy and creatively than I usually get to now, stuck behind a laptop. But I'm going to ask you briefly to talk about what you've had to change in your assessments, if anything, due to the coronavirus. Just a very brief description. Myself, for example, I had to change a presentation to a recorded PowerPoint, that sort of thing. For those of you who are watching on the WebEx, you'll see that I've been asked if I want to approve any student comments before they're posted. So you have the chance when you're using this collaboration board, which is very similar to Padlet, if you're familiar with that, to moderate. So if any of you want to say something particularly sweary, I could say, no, that's not going up on the board, but I will trust you all to be responsible and get involved in the spirit as intended and click no, and also apply for the rest of the session. So very quickly, just some brief comments here, if you're in the Neopod, about what you had to change about your assessments due to COVID-19. And you can, if you want to, share a picture down here as well.
And just while everyone fills something in, at the bottom right it says hide student names. So because you're presenting the teacher view, which wouldn't necessarily, like Stuart mentioned, be the way you'd normally do it, you can click that so that when things come in, they still remain anonymous and it's recorded the data. There you are. So now we can't see whose is what, but again, on your screen, you'll see it coming up. And there'll just be post-it boards where you don't see even the stars because it's anonymous from the student side of it.
I will unanonymize because you've all given your names. Jackie's point, added narrations to PowerPoint hastily, is exactly what I did. As I was saying, we changed them, and it was perhaps not the right thing to do. And I think that consulting with students might have helped come up with a more satisfying change, but we made quite a quick shift. And this session was partially inspired by the fact that I regretted not talking more with my students about those changes. You can see some more responses. Some were made all open book, some exams made to coursework. A lot of changes to coursework from some in-class things.
I'm intrigued by, so I've given it a heart. You can rank these as well by likes. There's the swear word one by Slim Shady. How have your what's changed? Are you swearing more or less now because of assessments?
That was me. I just wanted to see if he could delete it.
Ah,
It's got 3 likes, but I'm going to delete your comment. And
Okay, yeah. Now I know.
but what I could have done is add moderation and then said, "Oh, that's not on topic," and get rid of that in advance.
Okay.
If I had wanted to, I could have also hidden names, so no one would have known who it was doing this. With certain student groups, and you'll probably know which ones they are, the most high-risk approach, having hidden names and no moderation. Okay, we're going to move on to the next slide now, where I'm briefly going to talk about constructive alignment, but not for very long. Biggs is the guru of constructive alignment, and essentially the idea that assessments and teaching and learning outcomes all have to be nicely aligned to each other. And one of the ways that he sums this up is that, like, any topic, irrespective of your discipline, is about doing something with the knowledge that you've gained. So it's about knowing where you want to get to, how they can use that knowledge, is all about how you constructively align assessment. Now, I've shot myself in the foot by deciding to share my Neopod backend because I've asked you to put your hands up if you can confidently say what a learning outcome is for. So I'm going to just open the participant window again. So if you go into the participants list, raise your hand if you can confidently say what a learning outcome is and what it's for. Couple hands going up. Not too many. That's okay, because we've got something about that coming up as well.
I'm struggling to find where the hand raise is.
I was hoping you would know, Tom. The hand raise is in the participant list, I believe. There should be a little hand signal next to you, a circle with a hand in it, and you just click on it.
Ah, see, I don't have that option as the host. There you go.
What if you need attention?
For those that can't see the participant list, I believe if you go to the top of your screen, actually it comes up at the bottom. There's all the little circles. On the far left, it says mute, stop my video, share my content, and there's one for participant window.
On WebEx.
And this is in WebEx itself, not in Neopod, no. Sorry.
So we should have made that clear. We're changing back to WebEx for this. Partially just to demonstrate that audience response is something which is built in somewhat to WebEx. It's fairly basic, that you can put your hand up. I believe in the training one, I'm not sure in this version, you can use emojis as well, should you want to. I mentioned this in my previous session as well. It slightly makes my skin crawl, but students can show if they're happy or unhappy with something. So a few people saying they know about learning outcomes. This slightly visually demonstrates what I was talking about around Biggs's idea of constructive alignment earlier. You start off with objectives, what you want to achieve from a module, from a course, and then you develop learning outcomes. And that informs your assessment design. So I'm imitating the loop with my pen. And then that informs your teaching activities as well as the content. So if you're on the Neopod now, you should be seeing a fill in the blanks question, which if I just quickly flip to student view, I can demonstrate for you. Just thinking about it. There's a question which is about constructive alignment and learning outcomes. So it's another one from Biggs. As I said, he's the guru of this idea. And what you've got to do is drag the words at the bottom into the gaps to complete the sentence. And then you'll know what a learning outcome is for. I'll flip back to teacher view. For those of you following on the WebEx, you can see the back end. Neil has got 4 out of 4. I will anonymize now so no one gets embarrassed. That's something I didn't know. That if you choose to hide student names, it just automatically shows you the student view instead. Tom, is there a reason for that you know? Because I'd still like to see the scores coming in.
Not that I'm aware of. Only up until recently, this particular fill in the blanks exercise didn't even record the student data for the teacher to see.
Okay.
So it used to be just this. You used to just see the fill in the blanks bit. So they obviously haven't quite got to the, like they graying out the names, but still having the data. So
I'll quickly flick back over. Just check the people. Most people absolutely smashing it. Well done, those of you on the Neopot. This one hopefully wasn't too taxing. If it is, then I'm not going to show the student names again. It's just to show you another way that you can engage students in a session. So thinking about how you can fill what kind of text you could get them to fill in, and particularly if I'm thinking about co-creation of assessment, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. Like, this is a good way of getting them thinking about what the learning outcomes are, and that's usually a good starting point for co-creation, depending on how broad you're going, but particularly around assessment. Working backwards, starting with where you want to get to, which is that they have done something, they've achieved something, they've developed a competency, a skill, a knowledge. These are the kind of things that learning outcomes are summarizing. So getting them to think about what they actually are, which in my experience, although maybe it's more about my teaching, students don't really think about learning outcomes a lot. Anyone who's ever had to prepare materials for validation or revalidation or sat on a panel will spend a lot of time thinking about learning outcomes. And they should be in handbooks and what have you, but on a day-to-day basis, I don't know how much our students are actually reading these things. But in terms of understanding the rationale behind assessment design, starting with learning outcomes and making sure students do understand them, where they're going and why we're going there, is a meaningful thing.
Can I just jump in very quickly on I did that exercise on my other screen here. And again, I didn't know the answer to this before Stuart posted it up. But for me, again, not being in the same sort of academic position as many of you, was I didn't know the answer, but was able to kind of guess it by what made sense. Now, again, it didn't necessarily, that doesn't diminish the activity because it may have been fairly simple in a bit. But what it does is exactly what Stuart just mentioned, is the student is engaging with something and thinking about why the sentence made sense in that particular order, and you're then getting some sort of answer from that. So from someone, an idiot like myself, I was able to get 4 out of 4 as well, and just by kind of what made most sense to me from what was there as an option.
It's a comment from Jim about not looking deep versus surface learning. Agree completely. I don't. Biggs is not necessarily the be-all and end-all of these things, but learning outcomes are quite substantial part of quality assurance. So this is a useful way to understand them. But I think his deep versus surface learning is quite suspicious. But that's just me editorializing. We'll move on. You'll now have a question which might be a bit more challenging. And if I flick to the student view, those of you who are following on WebEx, it will have flicked to this view automatically. Those of you following on Neopod, of course, you'll see an open-ended question here. Another way of engaging students, just saying what makes a good learning outcome and why. So type your answer in. Now, Tom, I've said to type your answer in here, but I can't remember. Can you use different media for this, or does it have to be just a text?
You have to, with how this is built. Had you built this in Google Slides?
Yes.
Yes. So if you build it now within Neopod itself for this bit, and you can probably go back in and edit this within the Neopod environment, you can now do audio as well. There is an option. There's a beta feature for audio participation, so you could do typed, but you could also do speech, which again would work potentially like this, but wouldn't necessarily work in a class of 300 people where everyone starts trying to talk into their phone.
Yes, but I suppose if they're at home, that's less of an issue.
Exactly, yes, of course.
I think that's an important point about how I built this. So I built it in Google Slides, as Tom said, and then you can see them up here for those of you in the WebEx view. And then there's an optional add-on into Google Slides for Neopod, which lets you add individual sections about quizzes, but then you have to go into Neopod to launch the presentation itself, whereas you can build directly into Neopod, which I think Tom recommends, so I've just ignored him on this occasion. But you can also import PowerPoint slides into Neopod. Is that right, Tom?
Yes, if you've got a PowerPoint you've already created, you can drag and drop that PowerPoint in and it will convert them. Just a very, very quick bit on either Google Slides or the PowerPoint way of doing it is both are equally effective. They become less accessible because they are essentially being made into images. So anything that's got text on it, it will not be used by a screen reader. Whereas if you build directly in Neopod, they have their own inbuilt screen reader now, and it will do speech to text for those students that need that sort of accessibility. So if you're going from a point of you just need something to add in as an activity with something you've already made, if throw it in, it will work, and you can provide the students within Moodle an accessible version of the PowerPoint or PDF of the without the activity in. If you're going to start from scratch, if you build within Neopod, it's got the accessibility built into it.
So I'm showing you now in the WebEx view, the teacher view of Neopod, the back end, and it tells you some quite interesting things for this kind of question. So you can see here, it tells you how many people have participated. So 48%, I assume, jumped up to 52. I assume the remaining 48% are all just carefully thinking and crafting around what they want to say. It's jumping up as we speak. It also gives you an option of sharing. So I'm just going to click on this person, who I'm keeping anonymous, who said smart, and sharing that. So if we now flick to the student view, hopefully you'll be able to see what that looks like. But you should be seeing it already if you have the Neopod window open. So you can choose to flag up any individual comment that you think is useful, and that might be good for stimulating discussion. It might be good for maybe shaping some polls later, where you can get, if it's about sharing ideas and getting people to agree to them, which is what co-creation is usually all about, pulling out some key ideas is one of the most effective ways of doing this, because then you can get people to vote on what they like most. Was that a comment saying that they couldn't figure out how to add an image? I don't think it was done in this version, which is me being a novice using Neopod, but you can because I set it up through Google Slides, but if you build it directly in Neopod, you can add images. I'll flick back to the teacher view. And unshare that, so now you can see about 65% of you responded, which is a good number in my mind, so we'll carry on. Here's just some random thoughts of mine that I threw out about what makes a good learning outcome, because I always think it's good to compare your results to what's come off the top of my head, rather than anything that maybe Biggs has said in a more eloquent way. And I think there were similar things. I think realistic is a good one, which was similar to the people who were talking about smart, as well as time bound on the previous slide. So you see how it quickly moves back and forth between something that engages the audience and then content which I've developed, which I as a fairly newcomer to Neopod, I find quite satisfying. So I've talked about co-creation a lot, and anyone who's been to any session I've run in the past about co-creation will be probably slightly tired of seeing this, because I'm a big fan of this ladder, but partially because it's interesting to critique. It might be quite small text, but hopefully if you've got the Neopod app open, you can zoom in, or maybe if you've got it on a tablet or a phone, just move it closer to your face. Question about, can you share Neopod slides after the event? Tom?
Yes, essentially through the student paste option, which then gives it, you basically create a code for a particular Neopod, which you can then use in any way you like. So you can do it as a direct link, you can do it as embedded, so you can embed it directly in Moodle. And no, students can't zoom in on their screens. It is a...
That was my bad, sorry. as I said, I'm a novice here, and that's why Tom is here to tell me everything I'm doing wrong and answer your questions as well.
Yeah, so I've used my control and mouse wheel to zoom in on my browser, and what it's done is kept the image at the same size no matter how much I zoom. So it keeps the slide essentially the same, which is there where you get to the sort of element of, depending on what you're producing and why, you may need to provide other accessible versions. And again, if it's built within Neopod, it will, like I say, sort of screen read, which doesn't help for things like this, which are diagrammatic and have a structure to them, which is more than you'd get for what you can do within Neopod itself.
And I think that's a good point, because I didn't know that, so I've stuck this in here, and it's an interesting thing to think about, that I didn't consider the accessibility of this. So you could perhaps include this as it is, but maybe have a link to a different version, because this is lifted from a different, just from a journal article. So you could link to that article. You can also embed whole articles in Neopod if you wanted to, which is probably better for the student-based version than it is to stop and read an article in a classroom. But discussion in Catherine Murgatroyd and Abigail Lee's session about accessibility in tools like Neopod yesterday, and I think that they perhaps don't naturally point it out in the same way that doing things in Moodle does, because we have things like Blackboard Ally in there. But so we need to be conscious ourselves, and I've learned something there about not putting small graphics in. But anyway, this ladder essentially articulates different stages of co-creation, moving from a dictated curriculum at the very bottom to students in control at the top. And it's important to say that when we talk about co-creation, we're not talking about anarchy. We're not letting students run the university in anarcho-syndicalist communes where we contribute nothing. It's about finding a place, perhaps on this ladder, where you're comfortable bringing students in for having a say, or making some suggestions, or getting involved in shaping their teaching and learning. And in terms of assessment, part of that might be that you're quite low on this list, that it says about participation claimed but tutor in control, or limited choice from prescribed choices. But one of the main benefits of co-creating with the students might not be actually coming up with new ideas or innovating in any way. It's just about establishing a baseline understanding of everyone, what the students feel about things and what you feel about things. So everyone's on the same page. And that obviously only works with a whole group approach. And lots of examples of co-creation tend to work with small groups, which is fine, but you need to be aware of how you then feed that back to a wider group to have that same depth of understanding. Very briefly, Boval and colleagues who produced the ladder overleaf say that co-creation is when staff and students work collaboratively with one another to create components of curricula and or pedagogical approaches. And I guess what I'm suggesting is that co-creation does imply that you make something, you produce something new, you innovate something in terms of learning and teaching practice. But I think that maybe taking a step back from that being the natural endpoint is sometimes necessary, because it might be that when you're working with students, that the ideas you develop are the ones you have already. It reinforces that your existing practices are good, and that's not a bad thing. I'm certainly, when I'm advocating a co-creation approach, I'm not advocating innovation or recreating everything just for the sake of doing so. What I'm advocating is having those discussions with students to establish if everything is working, everything's clear, and if it's not, then you can start to generate ideas with your students about how to improve them. It has its roots in critical pedagogy and the idea that we're challenging a transactional consumerist idea with students by bringing them in as equal partners. Comment from Jim that the slides on Neopod are much clearer on web. That's good to know, because I wasn't sure how this would work as well, sharing the Neopod slides through the WebEx. And I think that is one advantage, is that students can have them in a way that they're more comfortable with. You can follow along on your phone, on a tablet as well, as we've discussed earlier.
Just quickly, Peter's made a point here about the ladder you had up a second ago,
Mhm.
and he said, maybe we need to say what our view is on the ladder and where we sit, basically in like the welcome message within Moodle. How do you take that idea of letting the students know what level of co-creation you're maybe going to be undertaking with them, and how you work that?
It's a very interesting question. I think that some of the things we'll come on to in a minute are about having those kinds of discussions with students, and I'll link to some resources which are useful for having discussions around pedagogic learning and teaching concepts with students that particularly came out around assessment and feedback, but similar processes. I would say that I think that sounds an interesting idea. I think it probably needs some scaffolding to make sure that students are on the same page. But I'd love to see how Peter does that, and I'm happy to get involved if you wanted to do something like that, because that could be an interesting way of starting those conversations. I think co-creation works best with openness, but a sort of scaffolded approach. So saying, this is what we're trying to do, this is why we're trying to do it. Maybe I'm here and we get up, and yes, you said maybe you could get it on a table. That might be a good way of doing it. It might be an interesting exercise to ask students where they think they are. Maybe not level 4 students, but if you wanted to do something with some level 6 students, where do they think the teaching is? Might be an interesting way of doing mid-module feedback or something like that. And then how can we get higher up the ladder? Do they want to get higher up the ladder? Oh, I forgot I changed the slide. So I have said here, co-creation doesn't have to be Big Bang. As I said, it doesn't have to be anarchy, just giving authority over to students. But I think Peter's suggestion is a good one here, that maybe talking to students about exactly how open or how co-created things are going to be is a useful way of structuring that. There's a lot of literature about co-creation across the sector, but we have lots of examples, including things that Peter's doing, which are fantastic around co-creating marking criteria, learning outcomes, some whole modules, and selecting content as well. But it is challenging to present examples, because I think in my experience, it can feel quite daunting to say, here is someone who's co-created a whole new module, when actually you might only be aiming for rung 3 or 4 on the ladder, but that's a step up from the bottom rung. Perhaps more than that ladder, this might be useful as something that DSAA developed to articulate how co-creation should be represented here in Portsmouth. Say here in Portsmouth, I'm currently sat in Winchester, but you know what I mean. And they've articulated it also as a ladder, but with only 3 points. It's about doing width, doing 4, and doing 2. So you can see it's got that same progression. And I think it might be more useful, because one of the problems with the Bovell and Bully ladder is you don't necessarily want to get to the top. The idea that students are in control, whereas staff and students working together as genuine partners is probably something that's more desirable for most people and in most contexts, though certainly not all. If you're in the Neopod link, if you click that, in the Neopod view, sorry, if you click that link, that'll take you to the DSAA's pages about annual.
You can't click that link.
Can you not click that link? Oh.
No, because it's come from Google Slides, it's made a PDF, so it's an image. What you can do, though, is take that link and add in, using the URL thing within Neopod, you could have added that as another slide, but it then needs to be another slide.
Okay. I see, I didn't realise that. This is so useful having you around. So don't click that link. But perhaps we can put that link in the chat later, and that has guidance from DSAA around how you can reconcile co-creation approaches with quality assurance processes, which is usually one of the main barriers, but actually we have a lot of flexibility here about how that works. Very briefly, just to follow up on what I was saying about it doesn't have to be complete student control. It might be just about picking particular elements which you're happy to co-create, and they could be quite high up the ladder, but an individual part of your teaching, assessment, what have you. In terms of assessment, this could be using portfolios where students have a say in what goes into them, because they're about their own personal, professional development. It could just be about clarifying things that don't work and fixing them. It could be about writing their own assessments. There's a lot of diversity. As we were alluding to, and with Peter's example of one way of approach, you have to be careful about how you broach the subject. You need to explain why you're doing it, and I think using the ladder is a good way of doing that, which I'd honestly never thought of. So thank you for that, Peter, because it articulates quite clearly what we're trying to do. We're trying to get higher up. We're trying to bring students in a more meaningful way. In terms of assessment, earlier when I had you defining learning outcomes and dragging bits of things around the board, that was just to start to show you that introducing students into these concepts is going to be important if you want to do anything meaningful with your assessments. I've called it informed consent here, which is a common term in research ethics, but I think an important part of co-creation is balancing the options with students. So say they develop a new idea, it's always important to explain to them what they're missing out on. So if you're changing something about assessment, then what would they be getting if you did it in the way that you used to do it? Or what other options are there? And Jim's raised a good point that when co-creating with students, sometimes they make harder assessments than you would used to. And I think that's an important thing to get right, is when you stop it, if you want to rein students in, explaining why. Similarly, I've run some activities in the past where I've got students co-creating marking criteria, and they tended to be after much stricter things than I would have asked for. So it's something to be aware of, that students tended, in my experience, and it seems like Jim's as well, to be quite harsh with their co-creation. And that might be where your voice comes in to rein that back and say, actually, no, we do it this way for this particular reason. Co-creation can also be about choice from different options. So it might be that you genuinely don't know if an essay or a report or a presentation would be the best way of assessing it. So sitting down with the students and saying, I'm trying to make this decision, here are the learning outcomes, what do you think would meet them best, is a good way of doing that. And as I said, co-creation doesn't necessarily have to be with all students, but it is always important to feed back to all students about how you've made these decisions, what's changed, why it's changed, and how it changed is important. So they realize it wasn't just on the fly. And I think that's something that sometimes gets left out, is that people do good things in a small group with students, but then it needs to be fed back to the whole cohort. And one of the reasons why we were doing this session around audience response tools is that it can be quite scalable for different kinds of co-creation. You can do this kind of activity with a room of 300 if you wanted to, but obviously that always comes with some limitations in terms of the richness. We had open text boxes just now through Neopot. We'll have a Padlet coming up shortly, but you're never going to get the richness that you'd get with people having a discussion in a small group about these things. Where some of these tools do allow you to record audio, you might be that you can get a bit more rich idea, and also things like intonation. You understand the strength of feeling of students, but also that's going to be a long time to go through, in the same way as sort of like coding and analyzing qualitative data almost. As Thomas pointed out, these links don't work because they're not links now. I've transferred them into Neopod. I will share them in the chat afterwards, but the DEFT toolkit is some it's a toolkit based on some research at, I believe, the University of Surrey by Naomi Winston, who co-created a range of resources with students about how they can engage better with their feedback. And it's all about scaffolding these ideas of, thank you, Tom, for sticking the link in the chat, scaffold these ideas of pedagogic literacy, so they know what we're talking about when we try to have these discussions with them. And as I say, the idea was so they could unpack feedback. So there's lots of exercises in there about understanding common terms used in feedback, like criticality, synthesis, whatever it might be. But there's also lots of just workshopable activities which can be tweaked slightly to support co-creation in that way. I've also added a link to our Moodle page, which if you go under your assessment tab in your own Moodle pages, you'll see the How to Use Feedback Effectively resource for students, which is based on the DEF Toolkit research. I've got about 20 minutes left, so I'm just going to skim over that because I think it's been self-evident that there are lots of different ways you can do co-creation, whether they're polls, voting on ideas, collaboration boards, breakout rooms for discussion, or raising hands. I won't dwell on this for now, but I'll also add some links in the chat shortly to some research, some activities that was done at the University of Bournemouth around co-creation, where they've recorded videos of both students and staff reflecting on the process. But I've put this quote I thought resonated quite strongly with me from my experience of co-creating things with students. Is that they discovered how little the students seem to know about that constructive alignment idea, that our quality assurance processes and then ultimately our teaching and assessment, there's thought that goes behind it. It seemed sometimes surprising to students, which is disappointing in my experience. But the idea that learning outcomes and assessment criteria are related to each other was new to this keen group of highly motivated students. I do recommend visiting that site, which I'll add the link to. But one thing you can do in Neopod, and I saw there were some things in the chat, is watch videos. And this is those colleagues from Bournemouth talking about that project. So you can see if you're watching in the WebEx on the teacher view, I've got the option to either play this video myself, this device only, or all devices. I'm going to click all devices unless Tom tells me otherwise, because I believe that means you'll watch it on your own device and you won't have to have that tinny weird thing where you're letting a video view from my screen. Is that correct, Tom?
That's correct. I put that in the chat earlier. I didn't know you had a video in there, so.
Wow, you should have looked ahead of the slides. I'm very disappointed. Not really, you're a star. So I'm going to play this video now, and it should play on your own screen as well.
I wouldn't play it here because it'll let me do it twice.
I was about to say that because it will go through the WebEx as well. But
yeah,
I will share the link to this. But you can see that embedding videos is quite straightforward, and as it seems that Tom has already said in the chat, it's good for bandwidth. It's also good for, unless you have two windows open like I do, because you wouldn't usually be using Neopod in this way. It's good for not getting that feedback, which is very frustrating. But I do recommend watching this video. We'll make a student paste version of this to share with you later, which we'll try and put on the Telltales Festival site, because these staff seem overjoyed with their co-creation experience, which is something I'm always looking for. So we've got about 20 minutes left, 15 minutes left. So for the next 5-10 minutes or so, I'm going to just do some more mock co-creation. So I'm going to get to you reworking an assessment for my module, Research Informed Teaching. So in the spirit of backwards design, starting with where you want to get to, and then unpacking the routes with students, the purpose of this module is to develop the skills to be a reflective teacher who can evaluate their own practice with data and theory. Where does this go? So we're going to break out from Neopod briefly because I wanted to showcase some other audience response systems and use Vvox. So if you go to vvox.app, I think I have to open the Vvox. If I stop sharing my slides briefly, so I can copy the link into the chat. There will be a question there for you to answer. I will share my screen again so you can see what the back end of Vvox. So on another browser window or on your phone, if you go to vvox.app and then enter that code which is in the chat. So you can see if I just move that out of the way, I can start to see people connecting to Vvox. So we've got 15 out of 5,000 potential people. I don't think there are 5,000 of us here or at the university in terms of staff members anyway. But you can have quite a lot of people engaging in a Vvox. I said open another browser window or a mobile because I find, Tom, I think you'll agree that Vvox is best as a mobile app.
Yep. There is, you can, so if you do the present option, you down the bottom left,
Yep.
present, and then open in a new browser tab. At the moment, it is just a chat. You need to open the question using this present option. Good job, I'm here, right?
Well, that was like we had a plan for this.
How dare you?
The wrong question.
Right, so if you go back to the top and you can do rerun, this is a new feature of Vvox. We can go back to and rerun questions that were already there. So 53, 7.
So you should be, yes, I can see people answering this question now. So there was a learning outcome on the slide earlier, which I've taken down. So you may all be saying strongly disagree just for that reason. But you can see that this is the first step on that ladder of co-creation. It's just me asking, we've got something, we've got a learning outcome. It's an important part of how we structure your assessment and teaching. Do you know what it means? And you can strongly agree, disagree. For those of you still watching in WebEx, you can see it's telling me how many people are responding. So we've got 22 out of 24. There's a comment from Irish about having to use the hyphens in the. Is that right, Tom? You have to use hyphens to get into.
No, it will automatically. If you just ignore the hyphens, just put the 6 numbers in. Yeah, no, there's no W's with this. It's not www.vvox. It's just type in vvox.app. But I've put the link again as a hyperlink in the chat.
So if I go back to the back end of Vvox, you can see I can see the answers coming in.
Again, if you go back to the present view, at the bottom there, there's that little like graph on the left-hand side. You can show the results live.
Yes, or I could choose not to.
Exactly.
Most people agree. That's good to know.
And it's also dynamic. So if I change my response, you'll notice it changes the. And now you can see it. You can see it's now wildly skewing the results, which is why it's sometimes a good idea to hide these until you close the poll so people see what the answer is at the end.
Now, obviously, you can imagine all kinds of uses for this kind of poll, and I think it's presented quite nicely. One of the advantages of Vvox, obviously, we're using Neopot to structure the whole session, is that there is a PowerPoint integration. And can you also have this kind of live response in there, Tom?
Yes and no. You can add the questions into Vvox in the PowerPoint side of things. It's not. You basically start the slide and you stop the slide, and so it's not live and dynamic like this is. But you will get the live question and then the response at the end of closing it. Just to feed forward, later in the week we are doing a session on Vvox more specifically. So again, if you're interested in learning more about this, we'll go over this in more detail. Again, looking at how, like Stuart's talking about now, how you could use it in certain teaching methods.
And I've used this for understanding of learning outcomes as that first step towards co-creation, but it can be used for any kind of comprehension or knowledge check. Just going to close that poll then and move to the next question. So you should see that it's automatically shifted you to the next question if you've still got the Vvox window open. And this is a question for you all about your opinion of co-creation. Which of these areas would you feel comfortable in working with students with? And unlike the previous question, we had to pick a response, though you can change it. You had to commit to one. This one, you can choose as many as you like, including just none if you want to. And that's fine as well, but maybe we can have a chat about that. So keeping the responses anonymous at the moment, although I can go, if I get that out of the way. It's hard to change tabs when you're using WebEx. I can see on the back end how people are responding. before I share it, and then I can share it and people can see how they're doing. A couple of people saying none, and I'd be interested to hear your rationale. Feel free to not give it. No one's being forced to co-create anything here, but a lot of people seemingly comfortable with a range of things. Assessment type being the most popular. If I just move that little bar out of the way, 72.22%, down to 2 decimal points, saying they're happy with assessment type, which I think is quite an interesting result. So that maybe we could unpack in the chat. So I'd like to hear if people have done that already, what types you could choose between. And obviously, again, going back to the learning outcomes, some learning outcomes are written to suggest a particular assessment type. It would be interesting to see. Sorry, saying the results are not shared with you. Is that the case for everybody?
You've got to close it first, so hit the big stop button.
Yeah.
And now it'll share back to your device.
And that's an important point by Peter, is that like changing things like learning outcomes does have implications for MARFs, for module amendment request forms, which I think had to be in last week, or maybe a few weeks ago. Lost track of time in these unusual times. But there are things about co-creation which don't influence those things. So if you were focusing on changing assessment type, for example, then that would have implications, though you can structure your assessment using portfolios perhaps to support those changes, to build in some flexibility. But we won't have time to unpack that in this session, but can maybe picked up later in one of the Tier 3 discussions, or if people want to approach me and Tom outside of this session, we're happy to work with you about any individual assessments you might be thinking of, including exploring where they can be changed that's in line with the quality assurance processes. I'm aware we're running out of time, and we'll probably all need lunch. So I'm going to skip doing this last section, but if we just go back to, can't ever change my tab when I'm using WebEx. I was going to ask you to use a Padlet, which about this learning outcome. So this is another learning outcome from the same course. I'm not going to do that now because we're short of time, but obviously Padlet would allow more open text responses. So the previous one, quite straightforward. Do you like this? Do you understand this? What would you be comfortable changing? Padlet, you can structure in terms of getting actual feedback from people, which might be a good way of getting rich responses from a large group. And I think we'll leave that there. So I'll stop sharing because we only have 5 minutes left, and there may be things that people want to discuss. But thank you, Tom, for your support, including pointing out the various mistakes I made. As I said, I was new to Neopot and relatively new to VVox as well. So part of what I wanted to do was show you not how it was done, but to show you that a novice can somewhat get to grips with it. But there's also probably benefit in trying these things out, either on your own and with some colleagues, to make sure that you iron out the kinks, i.e. don't use hyperlinks because they're not clickable apparently if you import from Google Slides, but they are if you build it directly into Neopot.
Yes, Neopot has the option of doing just that, and basically putting in a URL to a website. So that Padlet one, for example, you can essentially build a Padlet directly into Neopot, and you don't have to jump out of it. You can just keep using it. I'm now wondering whether you could build VVox directly into it. It's very Inception level audience response systems. But yes, there's a lot it can do. And again, if you want to ask me questions about that, and again, Stuart, obviously for the other side of this with the co-creation, do just get in contact with us both, and we'll try and help you where we can. If there are no other major questions, I will stop the recording now.
What was the benefit of VVox over Neopot? For this session, I purely used both just to show that there are a range of options that can do these things. And I would heartily not recommend mixing audience response systems if you were doing it yourself in a proper session, because as we could see, it gets a bit confusing, not least of all for me as the person trying to run it. What I think the main benefit for me about VVox is that I think it works really well on phones. So it's a good thing where if you were, say, had a PowerPoint running in a WebEx or a Google Meet already, You could ask students to respond to polls on their phones, and then they're not using their phones for anything else, but also means that you can get different sources. So where I had to be flicking in and out to different windows because of the way I chose to set it up, Vvox avoids that. They're similar in the fact that you can build Vvox into PowerPoint, but Neopod runs its own slides, and I think the advantage of Neopod for me is that you can control that pace. Tom, any thoughts?
Yeah, so just to pick back up on that one, the thing is they are audience response systems. So as Stuart mentions, they all do something very similarly in different ways. So it then kind of comes down to what you're trying to achieve for what purpose. Vvox is a lot lighter, so again you can just add a question. Just add a question into Vvox. From Vvox into your PowerPoint, and again we'll show this in our session later in the week if you're interested in it. And we'll be running that. I'll be running that session outside of this week's conference as well. Neopod, I think, it comes down to what you're trying to achieve with the students. So if you've got a lot of videos you want to show, as Stuart's demonstrated, by having it in Vvox, you're not having that horribly jerky replayed video across the stream. It's played directly to the student from YouTube, essentially, but you're not having to send them a link in the chat. It's just all contained. So Neopod for me is quite simple to use. I think it's fairly intuitive, but it is a heavy lifting tool because there are so many features you could throw at it. Vvox is essentially, we went with the Vvox because it has a really good conference kind of chat style that we sort of didn't really get to touch on today. But equally, it allows for quizzing, and there is also kind of a ranked score system as well, and it looks a bit more like and this is unfair to Kahoot, but it looks more like an adult Kahoot. It's not, I was going to say professional, and that's unfair because Kahoot is a very professional system, but it looks and it works in slightly different ways. But again, you can do it to be a quiz. You can do it to be like Stuart was using it just to gather responses, polls, and feedback. And with Vvox, there are 5 different kind of question types. One which is a free text answer, one which is a word cloud. There's a numeric, a rate scale, and then like a multiple choice where you can again choose to have multiple answers chosen or just one answer depending on how you're questioning and what you're polling. So we will go over this again later in the week.
Tomorrow at 9, I believe, the Vvox.
Tomorrow at 9, there you go.
You'll learn more about how you do.
But yeah, so they both do very similar things. I'm more than happy to have a sit down either the tea at 3 later on, or just later on after the conference is finished, once you get your head around something else. I'm happy to have that conversation about what you want to achieve, which is the system that's best to use, and we go from there. The only kind of caveat to all of this is although we are supporting both for the next year, at the moment the Neopod license runs out in 2021, of August of 2021, so you have it for the full teaching year, where I will try and continue it. We have Vvox now for the next 3 years on a site license. Neopod, we have 300 licenses. I have about 75 left, and someone took one halfway through the session today. So get your requests in quickly. Any other questions? Any other thoughts?